In the 12th century, a young man in the kingdom of Leon didn't just want to be a noble, he wanted to be king. But to do that, he would have to win. Leonese kings, Moorish armies, unruly crusaders, and even his own mother. For more than half a century of battles, conquests, blood, and strategies. In today's video, we will delve into the reign of Dom Afonso Henriques, the Conqueror, and understand how the founder of Portugal forever shaped the history of the country and its monarchy. Afonso was born, probably in 1109 in the county of Portugal, as the son of Teresa of Leon and Henry of Burgundy, and was the grandson of a king. On his mother's side, Afonso VI of Leon, who died without male heirs, and on his father's side, he was the great-grandson of King Robert II of France. And his mother from an early age began to use the title of Queen of Portugal, already intending to turn her county into a kingdom. But with the death of his father when he was only 3 years old, little Afonso was placed under the care of a tutor named Egas Muniz. Egas would be responsible for practically raising Afonso, turning him into a great man, endowed with military and political skills. And one of the ideas that Afonso had from an early age, encouraged by his tutor, was to turn the county of Portugal into an independent kingdom from Leon. And since he wanted to be king, the first step was to knight himself. So Afonso knighted himself in Zamora. In other words, he wasn't knighted by a king to whom he owed loyalty. He himself would be that king, knighting himself. And he would not accept any kind of submission to Leon. However, the one still in charge of the county was his mother, Lady Teresa. She lived with Fernão Pérez de Traz, a count who ruled Galicia, and many said that her interest was to unite her county with Galicia. And in this way, the succession conflict began. Afonso thus fought against the troops of his mother and the Galician count at the Battle of Salmamede, in the year 1128 near the castle of Guimarães. In this battle, Afonso's troops win, consolidating his control over the county of Portugal. In this way, Afonso was now the head of the county, but he did not call himself a count. Instead, he referred to himself as an infante, or prince. In other words, he was not yet a king, but he was also not a count in a county. He was destined to be something more. In this way, he set out toward the banks of the Mondego River, settling in Coimbra and beginning to plan his future territorial conquests. What's interesting is that at that time, Coimbra was exactly the border between Christian and Islamic territories. And, unlike other kings who took refuge in capitals deep within their territories, the Prince of Portugal established a permanent residence on the frontier. It was very common among the Moors to practice the razzia, which were quick and unexpected surprise attacks carried out to steal goods or inflict damage. And Afonso, by settling on the frontier, not only curbed this kind of incursion, but would soon begin to coordinate attacks into the interior of enemy territory, especially with the fragmentation of the Moorish taifas. In 1135, he conquered Leiria from the Moors and soon built a castle to consolidate his conquest. And even though the castle would later be besieged by the Moors, Afonso would hold on to this conquest. Next, he would conquer Urem and then the entire Portuguese Extremadura, causing the county's lands to advance even further towards the outskirts of Lisbon. The prince was a tall man, blond, about 1.90 meters tall, and was described by the Moors as the Great Dog. And Afonso was always with his troops, leading the raids into enemy territory, and it was during one of these raids in 1139 that Afonso had a peculiar experience. According to the Gautaran Chronicle, which is disputed by current historians and widely used in Portuguese nationalism, on the day of Santiago, July 25th, 1139, he decides to fight the Moors in the fields of Urique, engaging in a legendary battle against 5 Moorish kings from the taifas of Evora, Beja, Badajoz, Elvas, and Seville. In that battle, Afonso is said to have had not only a mystical experience, but also prophecies from Christ. In addition to having defeated the 5 Moorish kings, he was acclaimed by his troops for the first time as king. And with that, he incorporated the Byzants into his coat of arms, which would later become the arms of the Kingdom of Portugal. And so from 1139 onwards, Afonso would no longer be a prince, but a king, acclaimed by his own troops. Afonso would then try to conquer Lisbon in 1139 and 1142 with the help of Crusader troops from northern Europe. However, he would end up failing because Lisbon was a very large city and extremely well defended. In the following year, in 1143, he obtained recognition as King of Portugal from his cousin, Afonso VII, through the Treaty of Zamora. His cousin wanted to be recognized as Emperor of all Spain, so having Afonso as king wouldn't be a problem, since the emperor was above the kings. But Afonso never recognized or swore loyalty to his cousin as emperor. And the Portuguese king knew very well how to use the support of the military orders in his expansionist ambitions. During his reign, he donated many properties to various military orders. The Templars, for example, held properties such as the Castle of Suri, which protected Coimbra, as well as the Castle of Pombal and Amarol. The Portuguese king's plan was to have the military orders maintain permanent castles in the dangerous border region with the Moors. And these castles, with armed military garrisons, would provide security so that settlements could be established there, and these settlements would strengthen the Portuguese against the Moors on the border. This strategy would bear its greatest fruit in the year 1147. In March of that year, Afonso organized a real special operation with only 250 Portuguese soldiers, in which they managed to capture the city of Santarém, leaving the way open to Lisbon. Meanwhile, at the port, very conveniently, tens of thousands of Crusader knights from northern Europe on their way to the Second Crusade in Jerusalem disembark in Portugal. And there they were convinced by the bishop to help the King of Portugal in the siege of the great city of Lisbon. It would begin in July. The Northern Crusaders assisted the Portuguese in the siege of Lisbon, and after 3 months of siege, the great city finally seemed about to fall. The Crusaders managed to breach the wall, and under the command of an engineer from Pisa, built a 25-meter-high tower, equivalent to an 8-story building. Lisbon was bombarded with trebuchets, and the Moors desperately tried to attack the tower. They imagined that if it were ever used, the Crusaders would enter the city and massacre the entire population. Thus, the Moorish leaders of Lisbon agreed to negotiate. Afonso managed to secure the peaceful surrender of the city, which caused discontent among some Crusaders who wanted to sack the city. But Afonso manages to control the Crusader hordes and enters the streets of Lisbon singing Te Deum. And thus the jewel and future capital of the Kingdom of Portugal is conquered, along with the conquest of Lisbon. Afonso would conquer Almada on the other side of the river, and the Moors from another city, Palmela, out of fear, would also abandon that city. But Afonso would not stop there. He would conquer Alcácer do Sal, Beja, Moura, and Serpa. However, not all of them were easy. Alcácer do Sal is besieged 3 times by the Portuguese king, only falling on the 4th attempt. And even then, it would still be lost later, only truly being reconquered by Dom Afonso Henriques' grandson. But many of these conquests were also surrounded by special operations. The town of Moura is an example. The town is surrounded by the legend of Moura Salukia. It tells that the knights of Dom Afonso, in order to enter the city, attacked the Moorish entourage and disguised themselves in their clothes so that they could enter through the front gate of the city. After entering the city and announcing the attack, the Moorish woman who ruled the city threw herself in despair from the top of the wall. And so the knights, moved by this event, gave the place the name Town of Moura, which gave rise to the city of Moura. And, interestingly, in addition to Afonso's efforts, the Kingdom of Portugal also came to count on a mercenary, a master of special operations named Geraldo. Without fear, being an outlaw and a specialist in Moorish raids, he conquered, together with his men, the grand city of Evora in a surprise attack. Realizing the vulnerability of the city, he climbed the walls, spreading terror inside. And so, Dom Afonso grants Geraldo the possibility of becoming the mayor of Evora and gives him his name. But as difficult as conquering the cities was, keeping them was just as hard, and so some of them ended up being lost after long sieges by the Moors. One of the examples was precisely Alcácer do Sal, which, even though it had been conquered by Dom Afonso Henriques, was lost. Evora, however, even though it was isolated, remained a Christian enclave surrounded by several Moorish territories. Even with the surroundings of Evora falling into the hands of the Muslims, the city would remain Christian and under the command of Geraldo. But anyone who thinks that Geraldo Sempervor stayed holed up inside Evora is mistaken. Even with the city being isolated from the other Christian territories, he was always inspecting the defense of the Moorish surroundings, even many kilometers from his city, even many kilometers away. In 1869, he decided to lay siege to the city of Badajoz, in the east, almost 100 kilometers from Evora. In that siege, Geraldo's hordes attacked with such ferocity that they soon overcame the city walls, forcing the defenders to take refuge inside a fortress in the castle. But the Moorish city of Badajoz was a vassal of the King of Leon, who was Afonso Henriques' son-in-law. And so during the siege, they sent a message to Fernando II to defend them. At the same time, Geraldo calls upon Dom Afonso Henriques, who quickly arrives with a small army to help take the fortress. Already inside the city, what no one expected was that Fernando II of Leon would take a long time to appear, precisely because he would bring with him a grand army, forcing everyone to retreat, desperate and in the midst of confusion. Dom Afonso Henriques, already over 60 years old, ends up having his leg crushed in the city gates, under his horse, causing him to fracture his femur. This adventure in Badajoz would be the end of Dom Afonso's expansionism. If before he was the active and conquering king who climbed the walls of Beja and opened the gates of Santarém along with his soldiers, now he was an old king with a broken leg bone. Only in 1179 did Pope Alexander III, through the bull Manifestus Probatum, recognize the Kingdom of Portugal. Almost 40 years after Afonso declared himself king in Urique and was recognized by his neighbors in Zamora, and with the king already close to 70 years old. But the Moors would rise again very strongly with the Almohads, with great forces coming from North Africa. It was at this moment that Almohad Yusuf I tried to reconquer Santarém in 1184. The reconquest of Santarém would be a first step toward an Islamic reconquest of Lisbon. And it was at this moment that his son-in-law, Fernando II, who had previously harmed his father-in-law, Dom Afonso Henriques, would now come to his aid, helping Santarém resist the Moorish attacks. Afonso would die the following year, in 1184 or 1185, and would be buried in the monastery of Santa Cruz in Coimbra. And what is interesting about his whole story is how he had an unparalleled willpower to conquer what was his. He had to win the right to rule the county from his own mother, and then the right to be king over his cousin. At the same time, he was fighting against the Moors, reconquering city by city, invading castles, building others, and resisting sieges. He had to negotiate with Crusader knights to help him, and then negotiate so they wouldn't destroy everything. He knew how to use assault strategies like no one else, until he fractured his femur during a conquest, and that was when he was already over 60 years old. Afonso was a tall, strong, and simply unstoppable king, with a determined spirit who didn't inherit his legitimacy but conquered it. He would die as the first king of Portugal in one of the longest reigns in history. And his constant struggle and bravery would inspire for centuries, not only a dynasty, but an entire country, in a constant spirit of conquest and expansion, reaching the borders of the known world. And did you know the story of Dom Afonso Henriques? What surprised you the most? So, leave your comment right now to support our work and take the opportunity to become a member of the channel. That way, you'll have access to exclusive content. So you can not only support our work, but also dive deeper and learn even more about the fascinating Iberian history.